Okay, now we're being recorded. That's good. So thank you guys for coming out. My name is Nina Carter. I'm the president of the World Affairs Council in Olympia. And we have a very interesting program tonight about food sovereignty, global and local, local and global. What about food? I just know that we have food here and it's packaged in plastic too much. That's my opinion. So anyway, let me do a couple of announcements. First of all, tonight we will have a couple of our new board members. Raise your hand, please. We have Larry and Susan and Barbara. So thank you for joining our board. They were officially at our board meeting last week. Thank you. And of course, you all know out to the right are restrooms that way, and also to the left in the back, the restrooms. And here are some good things to know. Tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock, if you're interested, you can go onto our website and join a conversation with the Tacoma World Affairs Council, who has a speaker. I believe it's the Prime Minister from Denmark. No, Gary's waving at me. It's a discussion about Denmark and Greenland tomorrow online. Here, wait a sec. We'll get you on the microphone. So Gary was able to arrange this for us.
Yes, tomorrow morning is hosted by the Seattle World Affairs Council. So the two main panel speakers is the Danish ambassador to the U.S., and on the American side, it's the former U.S. ambassador to Denmark.
Thank you for the correction, Gary. So ambassadors will be talking tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock, and I think you have to register briefly. Register, don't you have to pay, but you can just register and then hear what they have to say about Denmark, and it's zero cost. If you're a World Affairs Council member, it's a zero cost. Otherwise, it's $750. No, it's not. Anyway, thank you, Gary, for that correction. And another important thing to know is that on May 28th, here again, we are going to have a special program. Steve Niva, as the flyer says on your table, will be here to update us about the current authoritarian regimes around the world and how they may be replicated here. So it will start at 6:30, not 7:30. We're going to start our programs a little earlier from now on. Doors will open at 6. Program starts at 6:30. Steve Niva will be here. So please join us for that update. And I've asked him to emphasize the court decisions that are being decided now and whether or not that affects authoritarian regimes in the United States. Last but not least, Gary also did a very good write-up on Haiti. In our newsletter and on our website, you can see his blog, the history and the potentially failed state of Haiti that we don't really hear enough about in the news, but he's done a very good research, some good research on that. So you can find that on our website also. So let me then turn to our speaker for tonight, Prita Lal, Professor Prita Lal. She is at Evergreen State College. She's been there since 2017, and she was brought up as a child of South Asian immigrants, first in New York and then in the South of the United States. And that had quite an impact on her academic journey, living in different parts of the country and then have parents from South Asia. And she became interested in social justice issues at an early age and worked at several community-based organizations led by low-wage immigrant workers and women of color in New York City. And she also spent 6 months in Senegal after high school. As an undergraduate, Senegal for 6 months. So her academic interests include the intersection of food and environmental justice, social movements, Black studies, cooperative education, and community-based learning. And she was also the faculty sponsor of the collectively run student cafe at Evergreen called the Flaming Eggplant. If you have not been to the Flaming Eggplant, I certainly highly recommend it. And it's run by a cooperative there. So she received her BA in French and anthropology from Tulane University in New Orleans. Then she has 2 master's degrees in sociology and South Asian studies, one from Columbia University and one from Stony Brook University, 2010. And then she got her PhD in sociology in 2016 at Stony Brook in New York. So please welcome Professor Lal.
Thank you. Okay, yeah, mine is on. Yeah, can everybody hear me? Okay, okay, great, thank you. So I'll probably move around, if that's okay for the Zoom folks. Yeah, hi to the folks on Zoom too. So thank you for that nice introduction, and yeah, thank you, Nathan, for bringing me into this, and yeah, thank you all for this wonderful opportunity. So I wasn't really familiar with the work that you all are doing, but now we're connected, so now I can follow your talks along too in the future. So I do a lot of qualitative research. So one thing we do a lot in our qualitative work is share stories and do storytelling. And so I just wanted these pictures represent some of my journey of how I came to Evergreen and got here. So I won't get into like too much depth because I want to make sure to have time for questions too. And by the way, as I'm talking to, if you want to ask questions, feel free just to make it more interactive. But I will say that, so I did my graduate school in New York City mostly, and I was working with different community organizations there, working with different immigrant communities and low-income communities, women of color-led communities, and then also pursuing my graduate studies. And as I was in my doctoral program in sociology, that's my kind of academic discipline and training, I was taking an environmental justice seminar, and that was really impactful and has had a really big impact on sort of my trajectory since then, and how kind of my analysis of understanding the world and social relations and, oh, okay, the clicker, thank you. But one thing that was like really challenging too about studying environmental justice and environmental sociology is that it just has a very like, a big emotional like impact too. There was an issue that we had too, that a lot of our students would get very depressed studying these issues. And so I just started really yearning for more solutions kind of oriented work, like scholarship and activism too. So food justice is what I'm hired to teach here at Evergreen, or in Olympia, not here, right here. But, and so food justice scholarship really sort of branched off of environmental justice, out of like environmental sociology and environmental justice sort of like literature, sort of like where food justice kind of off branched from. So, and so while I was in grad school, I was in a program called Farm School New York City, which some of these pictures, especially in the corner, are from my work there. And Farm School in New York City was a certificate program in urban agriculture. And so that's where I really started to do the applied work and learning more about food justice. And I just felt really like connected and really kind of alive when I was in those different communities growing food and helping. It's not really even just growing food, it's really growing community through these different garden and farm-based projects. So, and then my doctoral research focused on the intersections of gentrification and urban agriculture in New York City, and some of it was published in this edited volume called A Recipe for Gentrification, Food, Power, and Resistance in the City. And and is everything okay with the Zoom? Yeah. Okay. Okay. I just want to, they want to see. Oh, sorry. Okay. They want to see. Yeah. Well, maybe the camera can be more over here, because then it'll be easier for the notes if I have to see the notes. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Cool. Okay. Cool. So that's like a little bit more about my story and sort of how I came to doing this work. Why food? So thinking about, food is never just about food. We say it's always more than just food. But, as I learned through my work in the communities in New York City, for instance, and then also communities here also, like teaching at Evergreen. When the position opened up for a faculty member in food justice, my doctoral advisor thought that it was like the perfect sort of position for me because of Evergreen's commitment to doing community-based learning and applied learning, experiential learning, really like experimental education. And so we have a lot of really phenomenal partners that we partner with around food justice, that many of them are projects started by our alumni. Grub, Garden Raised Bounty, that's like a really famous one people usually know about, but many other ones as well. And so, yeah, food is a way to bring community together, for healing and liberation. That's why so many of the communities that I've worked with, really center food. Sometimes it's not even so much because they have an interest in food itself, but they know that food is a good way to bring people together. So, once you get them in the door, serve them a meal, and then you can start engaging with them on different issues that are happening in the community, or do more like political education and things like that. Food is medicine as well. I also have an interest in holistic health and holistic healing, and have studied different traditional forms of medicine, like Ayurveda, that comes from where my ancestors come from South Asia. And so food is definitely medicinal too. It's, can help us heal. Food can also be a weapon, though, as we were talking about earlier, that what's happening right now today being the Nakba. So as we see happening in Gaza, it's that many scholars have been noting that it's like the fastest famine that's been like man-made, that's been orchestrated happening to a group of people. Not the first one, but just the speed at which it's happening. And so food really being a weapon. Food can also be a form of resistance too. So at the same time, there's various hunger strikes happening now too. It's different college students especially in some California universities, and CSU, the California State University System. I have some colleagues that teach at different universities there, and so just following what's happening there. But a number of students are going on hunger strike in solidarity with Gaza, also at Stanford University. And so yeah, and then hunger strikes has a long history too, going back to, for example, Gandhi, who's a well-known practitioner of this as well, and the Indian liberation movement, independence movement. So so food can be significant in all these different ways. So a little bit about what I'll be talking about today is food sovereignty, this term food sovereignty. And this is a definition that I wanted to kind of offer to us from the U.S. Food Sovereignty Alliance. So it says food sovereignty is the right of the peoples to healthy and culturally appropriate food produced through ecologically sound and sustainable methods, and their right to define their own food and agriculture systems. It puts the aspirations and needs of those who produce, distribute, and consume food at the heart of food systems and policies rather than the demands of markets and corporations. And so this definition was actually coined by a network called La Via Campesina, which is an international network of food producers, fisher folks, small-scale producers, indigenous peoples that are located in countries all over the world. And they had first met at the United Nations Food and Agricultural World Food Summit in 1996. And since then, they've had a number of global sort of like convergences and meetings that I'll talk more about later on as well. But they have something like, they represent around 150 million small farmers, fishers, indigenous folks, agricultural workers from 80 different countries and 5 different continents. And so, some things to note about this definition is, one thing when I start talking to students about, what is food justice and thinking about what is the food system, there's some things to like uplift here is that, food sovereignty, similar to the term food justice, which I'll go over in a moment, sort of how these terms are similar and different, but it's really about putting power, so the concept of power is very central, power over how food is grown and distributed and who has access to it, putting that power into the hands of the people and both the communities and the ecosystems too. And so rather than concentrating that power over the food system into the corporations and the kind of the big companies and markets, which is how our dominant food system is structured today. There's a lot of corporate concentration of power in the food system. So there's something around like 10 corporations that control most of the market for the production and distribution and consumption and just all the different areas of the food system. And so what we see happening with that as a result, that there's a lot of really poor quality food that's also very toxic for both for the environment in terms of how it's grown, and then also for the peoples. And then there's issues around food access as well, rising rates of hunger, and even though a lot of food production has been increasing exponentially, but there's still issues of hunger that persist. So we also understand that hunger is one thing that making connections between the local and global. When I was coming here to my first time in Olympia, actually, when I was coming to do my on-campus interviews at Evergreen, they took me to visit the Freedom Farmers. So yeah, you have the book Freedom Farmers, but the Freedom Farmers at Olympia High School, which is it's this kind of like a Grub offshoot, but it was started by one of the founders of Grub, who then became a teacher at Olympia High School. And they basically do ag education especially for students that were on track for dropping out of high school. And they've been really successful in retaining those students and having them finish high school and go on and do successful things in their lives. And so one of the things that this group of youth said to me when we were talking, they were basically interviewing me when I came to Olympia for these campus interviews. One thing that they said that I still remember was, where there is hunger, we know there's oppression. And so I thought that was very insightful. So basically, when we understand that hunger isn't caused by a lack of food or natural causes, things like that. It's caused by our political economy and social relations that basically doesn't allow the food that is already available to get into the hands of those that need it. And so because of the fact that food is treated as a commodity. So when food is commodified, then people that don't have access to money to pay for it are going to be experiencing insecurity, food insecurity. And so food sovereignty is really about again, decommodifying the food, putting it into the hands of putting control of the food systems into the people, into the communities, and ensuring that the food too is sustainably, ecologically grown in harmony with the earth and natural systems, and also culturally appropriate, nourishing in that way as well. And so, a little bit more about why food sovereignty is significant. So again, in honor of Nakba, the Nakba Day today, these are some quotes from the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to food, Michael Fakhri, who's actually a law professor at the University of Oregon. So he wrote a report last year called Starvation and the Right to Food, with an emphasis on the Palestinian people's food sovereignty. And so, these are just some things that he said in the report. On October 9, 2023, Israel announced a starvation campaign against Gaza. By December, Palestinians in Gaza made up 80% of the people in the world experiencing famine or catastrophic hunger. Never in post-war history had a population been made to go hungry so quickly and so completely, as was the case for the 2.3 million Palestinians living in Gaza. And then he goes on to say that actually, before I get to that part, he talks about, like in Palestine, the famine in the Sudan was possible because of a protracted crisis and long-standing structural issues in its food system. The famine in Sudan is causing an unprecedented number of people to suffer. Over 25 million civilians in the Sudan and fleeing the Sudan are being starved and require urgent humanitarian assistance because of the war there. And globally, over 281 million people face high levels of acute food insecurity in approximately 41 countries or territories. So for example, Mali, Palestine, South Sudan are the highest levels of concern. And he also says that starvation is one of the most brutal ways to attack the food sovereignty of a people or a community. Starvation methods include blockades, water deprivation, food system destruction, and the general destruction of civil infrastructure. Starvation often leads to forced mass internal displacement and forced migration. Unfortunately, the prevalence of starvation around the world is increasing. So again, even though we see food production, yields increasing, for instance, or lots of food going to waste, that's another big issue in the US especially. Something like half of the food that's produced in the US ends up in a landfill. So even though like there's massive amounts of food being produced and also being wasted, there's still these increasing levels of hunger and more extreme forms of hunger, starvation and famines happening. So we know that the cause really has nothing to do with food. It has to do with like the control of how the food system is structured and set up, and more about political and economic reasons. There is one graphic report too that I think maybe if there's time I'll come back and share, but so the special rapporteur collaborated with an artist, Omar Khoury, who's a renowned artist, and basically just putting a lot of illustrations to capture the really difficult realities that he was writing about in his report. But you're welcome to like take a look at the PDF, but I'll come back to it. I was going to share maybe some of the images from it, but I don't want to mess things up right now, and then also make sure we have enough time to get through everything. So one concept that goes along hand in hand with food sovereignty is this term agroecology. So as I said in the definition of food sovereignty, it's growing food in a way that's ecologically sound, so growing food in harmony with ecosystems, with nature, in a way that really regenerates life, the capacity for there to be life on this planet. And so agroecology is another term that we use to describe this way of farming. So understanding and designing food systems using social, ecological, and political principles to regenerate nature and create a more just society. And agroecology is rooted in indigenous practices and ancestral knowledge, which are combined with scientific knowledge to address the current food crisis. Agroecology is not about changing farming techniques, but also about transforming, or not only about that, but also about transforming policy, science, cultures, and economies to bring about more just food systems. And that's from the University of Vermont's their Institute for Agroecology. And so we think of agroecology as a science, a practice, and a movement. So, and again, the leadership for the coining of this term and this definition and the work that's happening in agroecology really comes from communities in the global south, especially. So countries that were formerly colonized by different European empires in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, especially Asia, Latin America. So especially the peasants from these countries, they've all been leaders in that network, like Via Campesina, I mentioned. And agroecology is a term that's really, the definition really comes from like the leadership of these communities in terms of how it's been coined and how it's practiced. And just a little bit of like comparing and contrasting is a few of these terms I've been using. So we have food sovereignty, as I've been talking about here, and then there's also food justice, and then food security. You may have heard the term food security before too, but that's something that's used a lot in the US especially as well. So just a little bit of comparison and contrast. So food sovereignty really refers to like more rural areas, especially in the global south. It's used more in the international context, and really has a focus on like food producers, and overlaps a lot with the term food justice as well in terms of having a shared power analysis around, again, getting power away from corporations and into the peoples and into the stewards of the land. And then food justice is a term we tend to use more in the US. I think one explanation I've heard a colleague say before is because to use the word sovereignty in the United States, where we have that's a settler colonial country, just to have, to not sort of like, use the term too broadly in a way that can be like, maybe infringe upon tribal sovereignty, the notion of tribal sovereignty. So we tend to use the word food justice more in the US, and it tends to include more urban areas, so not just like the rural areas, and more consumers of food, not just like producers. And then, but yeah, also a big focus on the structural issues that are the impediment to people being able to like have ownership and control over the food system. Then food security is a term that is used a lot more in by the US government, especially, but it's more of the idea with that is it's more about like accessing food rather than having ownership over the food system. So it can have more ties to the industrial food system and to corporate food systems. So we could think more about like a lot of food banks, for example, that they represent food security because they're ensuring access, that people can have access to food, but the quality of the food is questionable. And then it could be, just like a lot of processed food are sort of like byproducts of the industrial food system. And then, it's not really necessarily about addressing the root cause of why people are hungry in the first place, or how people can have access over the food system or more ownership over it. And then these are some of the principles of food sovereignty. So, it's from the ground up, very grassroots, focuses on food for the people, values the food providers, localizes the food systems, puts control locally again, and then builds on knowledge and skills of the people, and then working with nature. There's this concept, this idea of scaling out rather than scaling up. So in the industrialized food system, it's this idea of like scale, like, again, a very small number of corporations that control most of the market for so many parts of the food system. And in food sovereignty, it's more about like, instead of having more concentrated power, like smaller food producers or smaller farmers controlling like bigger and bigger farms or like bigger and bigger swaths of the system. It's more just about like having like more of a multitude, more of a kind of a patchwork of like lots of different food producers and farmers and sort of networks, but they're all like kind of smaller in scale and interrelated with each other through this larger movement for food sovereignty. And then, we can think kind of about how like each of these concepts all work together. So there's like a metaphor of this three-legged stool. This is coming from one of my colleagues, Jehi Chappelle, who's a political agroecologist. And he calls it the three-legged stool of food system sustainability. So if you imagine a stool with three legs, one leg is food justice, another is food sovereignty, and another one is agroecology. And so, it's kind of thinking about how each of them are, an important part of sort of the larger food system sustainability. And any questions or things? Okay.
You're asking us to digest a lot just to use a pun on purpose.
Yeah.
Yeah. I do have one question.
Sure.
Earlier when you were talking about sovereignty.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Good. Yeah. We'll take one question now, and then we'll do it. Yeah. It's totally fine. Yeah. It gives me a break too, a water break.
Okay. I think I got it right in sovereignty. There's some issues or principles of indigenous practices and cultural appropriateness and stuff. But I was thinking about the fact, especially because you said you have South Asian heritage. Mm. It seemed to me that one of the huge events, I'm thinking 5 or more decades ago, probably more than that, was the Green Revolution, which basically was introduction of mostly fertilizing, I think. So do you think that's consistent with sovereignty or this indigenous?
No, yeah, I'm going to actually talk about that too. So that's good. That's a good kind of like lead up to where I'll be going. But no, the Green Revolution was definitely not. It was definitely an assault on the sovereignty of the local food systems in India and other countries too, where it was implemented and still being implemented. But yeah, definitely, I'm going to connect to that. That's where I'm going. Just in a moment. So yeah, thank you for that. But yeah, just actually comparing this. There's actually a quote from David Suzuki that I like to use as well, just to juxtapose like the Green Revolution and the concept of food sovereignty, or this practice of food sovereignty as well. But they really represent two different paradigms. And so there's like the paradigm of, we could call it like ecosystems, and then the paradigm of like I like to call it empire, but Suzuki's referring to it more as economies. But he says here, we are part of a vast web of interconnected species. That is the biosphere, the zone of air, water, and land where all life exists. It's a very thin layer. That's our home. And if we don't see that we are utterly embedded in the natural world and dependent on nature, not technology, not economics, not science, for our very well-being and survival, if we don't see that, then our priorities will continue to be driven by man-made constructs like national borders, economies, corporations, and markets. Those are all human-created things. They shouldn't dominate the way we live. And so I find this quote compelling because I feel like it represents how food sovereignty and agroecology both represent a different paradigm from our current dominant food system. And so I just wanted to uplift these two paradigms for a few moments now. So I refer to it the paradigm of holism, or traditional ecological knowledge, also we call it. So again, based on indigenous cosmologies, indigenous worldviews, this notion that everything is connected with everything else, this notion of we are all related, humans, landscapes, ecologies, all intertwined. We're part of the earth is part of us, and disturbing one part of the ecosystem impacts the entire whole. And understanding diversity as an asset and strength of a natural system. And these ideas I've also drawn from a variety of different indigenous scholars, like Robin Wall Kimmerer, and many other practitioners too in the areas of agroecology as well. And this notion of 7 generations, our actions that whatever we do today, thinking about how they will impact the next 7 generations, and having, giving that attention as well in our actions. And that which really encourages a more like long haul, like kind of slow thinking, and which is very different than our economic system that's focused on like maximizing profits every quarter. Some other aspects of holism is that all creatures live in harmony. There's like an obligation or responsibility to foster and maintain healthy relationships. So one thing that's distinct about indigenous worldviews is that it's very much focused on responsibility. And in the West, there's a big focus on rights. So like the human rights or civil rights, we live, so therefore we have the right to certain things or a right to consume. Whereas in indigenous worldviews, it's more about responsibility. So I eat salmon, so now I have a responsibility to the salmon to protect their ecosystem so they can continue living for future generations. So responsibility, I think, is kind of a distinction because it also is more relationship-oriented, and relationships that are more symbiotic, mutually beneficial, and cooperation rather than competition, which has allowed life to evolve. And there's a lot of interesting work among even like in evolutionary biology that's kind of challenging a lot of the sort of dominant ideas we've been brought up with about competition and Darwinism and things, but it's actually cooperation that's allowed ecosystems and species to like live on like longer and to flourish more. And seeing the cycles of life, nutrient cycling, things like that, but like life follows death instead of a more linear way in the Western mindset. And there's another Native scholar by the name of, let me make sure I have the names in my notes, Ronald Trosper, who is a professor of Native American Studies, and in some of his research has identified 5 features of pre-colonial sustainability in the Pacific Northwest. So thinking about the Coast Salish people in particular, that these are 5 features of Coast Salish society that has, for him explains the sustainability of their natural, sort of, I guess we call it natural resource management practices, but that's also kind of a more Western language, but the way they've been stewards of the lands and waters. But this idea of proprietorship, that a pattern of property ownership that does not include the power to sell property or otherwise dispose of it by contract, contingency. So the leadership structure is centered around like houses. So like house leaders complying with community standards to obtain and keep their position as head of title holders to the land and resources. So again, sort of like community accountability is a big part of that. Environmental ethics, having a particular set of environmental ethics held by the community to find abuse of land in terms of reduction of its future productivity. So again, thinking about the 7 generations. This notion of reciprocity is very central. So again, the leadership being structured such that the house leaders were generous with the products of their territory, sharing surplus with the expectation that others share their surplus in return. And again, this public accountability. So the consequences of the house leadership's management of the resources is publicly displayed through potlatches, for example. And really thinking about accountability being a central part, because I often tell students there's really no integrity without accountability. So, like a group or like a company, they could say they're doing all kinds of great things for the environment or for the people, but if they're not being held accountable by the people impacted by those actions, then there's no integrity. So the accountability piece through these public displays is an important piece as well. Those are some aspects of what I'm calling the paradigm of holism. And this is based on traditional ecological knowledge, indigenous ways of stewarding lands, for example, and Earth's resources or environments. Thinking about using terms like resources too is kind of an extractive term, but it's distinct from what I call the logic of empire or capital. And so rather than interconnection and interbeing, this idea of alienation is a characteristic of capitalism, which is the worldview that our dominant food system is based upon. There's also this Cartesian dualism, so the split between matter and spirit. Man having control and power over life, seeing the earth as resources to be extracted for profit. Food systems are not evaluated based on their ecological and social contributions, but rather on their productivity and market yield. And then a form of reductionism, so seeing the earth as a machine made up of disconnected parts and constantly needing these man-made technologies to survive. Or, for example, we're constantly at war with nature, war with bugs, war with this super weeds or whatever it is, and so needing to have more chemicals, genetically engineered seeds in order to survive because we're at war with Earth in that way. And this is, again, distinct from seeing the Earth as sacred, for example, indigenous worldviews. So there's a ecofeminist by the name of Starhawk who said something in one of her writings that no longer were the groves and forests considered sacred. The concept of a sacred grove, of a spirit embodied in nature, was considered idolatrous, because when nature is empty of spirit, forest and trees become merely timber, something to be measured in board feet, valued only for its profitability, not for its being, its beauty, or its part in the larger ecosystem. So yeah, this is basically, this sort of paradigm or worldview is what our dominant food system is based upon in that way. And just to be a little bit more specific on some of the examples, so agroecology represents holism because it's farming in a way that works in harmony with nature. So looking at the farm as an ecosystem and looking at things like biodiversity as a measure of how healthy that ecosystem is. So biodiversity through planting a wide diversity of vegetable, herb, flowering plants, practicing crop rotations, companion planting, attracting various beneficial insects, use of compost, integrating animals into the system as well, and then really farming the soils in those ways. And so the logic of empire we can see comes through in the industrialized agricultural system. So farming in a way that seeks to control, manipulate, dominate nature through things like confined feedlot animal operations, so putting many animals into like a confined factory where they're very much, they don't have the freedom of movement, they're very much controlled and given various drugs, and you just treated in very just very very unethical ways. And then the separation too of plants from the animals. So you have animals growing in the factories, then you have monocultures of plants growing separate from the factory farms, the animals. And so there's monocultures of plants really requiring petrochemical intensive inputs like synthetic fertilizers, synthetic pesticides, a myopic focus on yield. So a system is evaluated based on how much yield it produces. So needing to have more and more production of corn or soybeans, and sort of the measurement based on how many pounds are being extracted from one area of land. Also genetic engineering of seeds, and also plants and animals as well. The use of fossil fuel dependent vehicles, industrial scale, production for profit rather than for sustenance. And there's enormous, harmful ecological and social externalities. And so a more concrete example of the logic of empire is the Green Revolution, we're just talking about. So this is a program that started in Mexico in the 1940s when the Rockefeller Foundation launched a research project to improve, again, agricultural yields. So again, how much grain could be grown in a certain area of land, measured in terms of the pounds, for example, the weight of grain being grown. And so it started in Mexico, and then in the 60s expanded to India in this area, the Punjab region, which I think was this like no, I don't think this was the. Oh, okay, no problem. That's fine. I'll just keep it there. But yeah, anyway, so it's that area, that pink area at the very top in the kind of northern part of India. And it ended up benefiting the wealthiest farmers and landowners while the poor farmers suffered because it's very expensive to use the various inputs that they had to use. So a lot of the various chemical fertilizers, for example, and herbicides that you had to like purchase. And so the poor farmers couldn't really, they didn't have like those resources to purchase those inputs up front. And then also it favored large-scale production too, so people that were farming on smaller plots of land weren't really able to like scale up in these ways. Monocultures ended up destroying a lot of the indigenous seed varieties and the biodiversity and unleashed chemical-intensive farming that depleted the soil. There are also a lot of various social impacts as well, destroying a lot of the indigenous networks and ways of like saving seeds and a lot of the traditional knowledge that got undermined and wasn't, and ended up being lost through a lot of these processes as well. Vandana Shiva is one activist in the area of food sovereignty and agroecology. He's written a lot about that and about this topic of the Green Revolution. And she says that these new crop varieties that they became with a package. So they had to use like these special hybrid seeds and then use the fertilizers and the chemical inputs to go along with them as well. And there's also a massive displacement happening of local indigenous seeds and agricultural systems that have been built up over generations, and also the knowledge that they accumulated over centuries. And farmers ended up finding themselves trapped in cycles of debt in order to pay for the inputs, for the high cost of seeds, the high cost of fertilizers, high cost of pesticides. And then they often had to buy those on credit. And then the debt cycle, especially if the season wasn't as like productive as they were expecting it to be, then they weren't able to get out of debt. And then these debt cycles caused a lot of stress. And there's actually really high rates of farmer suicides in India as a result, and the debt is a major reason for that. And some other things that Vandana Shiva goes on to say too, it wasn't really a green revolution either. It was actually more brown because it was depleting the soil. The various chemicals that were used in these inputs, they degrade the conditions for like life in the soils. So, and there's also a lot more runoff as a result. The soil microbes also die off with these various chemicals. And so the soil is less alive, so hence it becomes much more parched and kind of devoid of life in that way. And then, and then also the debt, as I had mentioned as well. And let's see, anything else here? And a lot of the mutual relationships that the farmers relied on before the Green Revolution became much more weakened as a result too of this program. So the farmers, instead of their own like indigenous sort of like collectives and structures they had of like trading seeds or kind of sharing resources with each other, they had to deal with these like banks and like these outside kind of institutions that came in. And then so it also weakened a lot of the kind of the community connections as well. There was a report in an article in the U.S. News and World Report called "The Toxic Consequences of the Green Revolution," and they said that the Green Revolution has devastated the entire ecosystem of societies here, the ecology and the economy, and lost almost all of the biodiversity, resulting in this focus on input-intensive, technocentric, resource-guzzling inputs, and a lot of loss of self-sufficiency as well. So so in many ways, this was very much like a assault to the sovereignty of the people and communities, because they became dependent on these on these chemically intensive inputs that were produced by companies based in Europe or in the U.S. and it undermined the sovereignty of the local communities. Currently, there's a green revolution in Africa that the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation is pushing, that's also very much similar to the green revolution in India, a very corporate and technocratic industrial model of agriculture into Africa through a promotion of using patented genetically engineered seeds that rely on chemical pesticides and fertilizers as well. And so some of the things about the patented seeds, like I said, they can't be saved. And so that requires the farmers to have to keep buying seeds, and that leads to more debt as well. And some pieces too, thinking about these different paradigms. And I'm going to start to, okay, yeah, I might skip over some of these slides because I want to make sure we have time for discussion. But thinking about, so we have the paradigm of holism, which I talked about is like agroecology and food sovereignty sort of reflect that distinct paradigm. And then we have this logic of empire that the Green Revolution, for instance, represents that, or industrialized agriculture. And so really thinking about how these problems in our food system, thinking about systemic problems are really requiring holistic solutions. And so there's a lot of talk now currently too around things like regenerative agriculture, which many people in the sort of the food sovereignty realm are critical of because they feel like it's a term that's also being used a lot by corporations, and that it tends to have a reductionist focus on carbon sequestration, like trying to just grow healthy soils, regenerate the soils, which is an important piece, but it's disconnected from the bigger like systems change. And so because of that, its lack of systems focus and lack of more holistic focus, it can just lead to more of the same, more technocratic solutions that don't really address the root cause, but can actually exacerbate the inequities that are underlying the issue. And things like carbon smart agriculture, again, relying on corporate technologies that can undermine the sovereignty of people in the global south, or the majority world, as some colleagues prefer to use. Okay, so thinking about what would be a more holistic solution, the solidarity economy. So this is a graphic that represents what we mean by the solidarity economy, but it's thought of as an alternative to a capitalist economy, and in which the people, again, play an active role in all aspects of the entire economy. And cooperatives are a big piece of this, and food cooperatives, again, just kind of taking the bringing power away from the corporations into the people through a lot of these different practices: fair trade, food co-ops, worker co-ops, and then community gardens, various initiatives like that. And a big focus on democracy, really applying democracy in all aspects of how we relate to each other, how our economy functions. Mutualism, solidarity is a big piece of this as well. A pluralistic and organic approach, allowing for different forms in different contexts. So that's why it's not necessarily about scaling up one model, but really scaling out and having a multiplicity of different ways of organizing and relating from the bottom up. And one thing that's interesting to note too is that small-scale producers in the world today grow about 75% of all the food that's consumed in the world. So outside of the US especially, most people are the food that they're eating isn't grown by big corporations, it's grown by small-scale food producers. So small-scale producers operate about 75% of the world's agricultural land and grow a majority of the world's food, not the corporate agricultural system. So it's interesting to think about this idea of the solidarity economy, how in other parts of the world, it's really how most people are able to sustain themselves. And then let me just skip over a couple of these things because they're not quite as important, but I do like this visual of composting empire because I think it also kind of connects with what I was talking about before with the logic of empire. But this is a mural from an organization called Planting Justice that's based in California, and they do urban farming work, and they work mostly with formerly incarcerated people. So this mural, it's at one of the high schools in Oakland, where they run some of their community gardens. This one's called McClymonds High School. And this notion of compost the empire kind of speaks to their theory of change and approach to doing food justice. So using this as a metaphor to inspire the belief that oppression never lasts because it produces conditions that people resist and use to build more equitable societies. And I think it also relates to the traditional ecological knowledge or the paradigm of holism I was talking about earlier, to this idea of like cycles as well, that like death leads to new life. And so compost is like a form of death in nature that leads to new life. So, oppressive conditions, like we see so much death happening now through the wars and famines and so many things happening today, that that those are actually like opportunities for healing and for new life, that through the oppressive conditions arises the opportunities for people to really co-create the world that they want and need, sowing the seeds that the future generations, think about the 7 generations, will reap. And then just a couple notes too about I talked about the La Via Campesina and how they had their first conference at a UN World Food Conference in 1996. And so since then, they've had a number of global forums and meetings. And so in 2001, they had a forum in Havana, in Cuba. So delegates from different peasant, fisherfolk, indigenous people, civil society, and academic organizations met at the World Forum on Food Sovereignty. And then again in 2007, they met in Mali. And so that was called the Nayeleni Forum. And so that was back in 2007. And that was a defining milestone for food sovereignty. They had brought together more than 500 people from 80 different countries to pool together their ideas, their strategies, and actions to strengthen the global movement for food sovereignty. And then they wrote a declaration in 2007 that encapsulated their vision for this movement. And then they're planning to do another forum this year in 2025. It's supposed to be in India, but it's going to happen in Sri Lanka instead in September. So I have a number of colleagues and friends that both from New York, and then also just some other colleagues located in other places they'll be gathering all together in Sri Lanka later this year. And so this Nayeleni, this is the third global forum, and it'll bring together one of the most diverse representations of the world's working classes, expanding beyond its traditional base of small-scale food producers, building upon joint proposals and actions to confront the interconnected crises facing humanity today. And some of the things they talk about in their statement, thinking about connecting food to all these other issues around the social and solidarity economy, feminist economy, this notion of buen vivir, living well, health for the peoples, and just really working towards systemic transformation. And just maybe one little quick note, and then we'll wrap up and have our discussion. And I think there's questions coming from the chat as well. So I did want to just maybe end by, again, connecting back to this paradigm of holism and traditional ecological knowledge. This is just some words from activists, a food sovereignty activist based in the Aotearoa, the Maori food sovereignty activist, Catherine, and I'm not going to say her name correctly, but I'll just try, Muru Paenga Iken. And she recently did an interview in a publication called Agroecology Now, and she talks about how the importance of really centering spirituality in food sovereignty movements. And I would just say in movements more broadly as well. I think just given how extreme, all the different crises that are happening today, I think this is just one important piece that's missing in a lot of activism work that I think it's important to uplift. So Catherine says, activism is not just about political change, it's about spiritual alignment, and really reflecting on this idea of what role does spirituality play in food sovereignty struggles. She goes on to say that, spirituality is foundational to our activism. When I look at a situation and I see what is balanced and I see what is imbalanced and needs healing. And our activism is about restoring balance and healing those wounds. So she says, when we fight for sovereignty, we're fulfilling a spiritual obligation, not just a political one. The natural world is sacred, and the ongoing violations by the colonial state and corporations create disharmony, not just politically, but in the very fabric of existence. Going back to my Maori roots and values makes me look at the world through the lens of the environment being related to us genealogically. That really changes everything. We are integrated, we are connected, we are very profoundly linked. Planet Earth is a living thing. She has her own consciousness, and the interesting thing here is the metaphysical activism. We must have balance in the world. If you don't, then you get what you see all around you. The world is sick and it needs healing. The healing is all about making things right in terms of ensuring we comply with the natural laws. From a Maori perspective, this is passed down by our ancestors. And what has integrity, what has compassion and understanding. If you align, then you have harmony in the world. As soon as you deviate from any of that, then you get disharmony. And this is very simple at one level, and this is what drives me personally. When I look at a situation, I see what is imbalanced and needs healing. I try to bring it back into alignment with the basic principles we were taught. And she says that our activism is about restoring balance and healing those wounds. Desecration of sacred sites, pollution of water sources, and destruction of traditional food systems are all forms of spiritual violence that require deep collective healing. Looking ahead, I believe the most transformative work will come from bringing together indigenous wisdom keepers, spiritual leaders, and even Western scientists who are exploring consciousness and the nature of reality. We need to shift our activism from reactive struggle to proactive metaphysical activism, using spiritual power to shape the world we want to see, rather than just resisting the one imposed on us. This shift requires us to trust in our own knowledge systems and recognize the limitations of colonial methodologies. It means creating new spaces for ceremony, storytelling, and intergenerational learning as acts of resistance and renewal. So yeah, I think that was just like a term I wanted to end on when she talks about this term metaphysical activism. Some concrete ways she says she does that is through, before they start their direct actions, they start with what's called a karakia, incantations to align oneself with the energies of the universe, to ensure the presence and guidance of our ancestors. Many Maori activists view their efforts as fulfilling sacred duties rather than engaging in purely political struggles. And a lot of this work too is about challenging sort of this alienation, this disconnect that colonialism has wrought, as she's describing, on their peoples. And I think it's also just something really educational for all of us to consider as well. So yeah, I'll just end it there so we have enough time for some questions. I think I went over a little bit, but yeah, thank you all. Okay.
Thank you, Prita. A lot to absorb and a lot to think about, and I think there might be some questions.
And there's some in the chat
And then
too.
some in the chat. So we'll take one here and then we'll go to the chat. If you would speak into the microphone.
Yes, I'm John Erickson. I thank you. And I just wanted to begin by moving forward from your ending. I'm struck with the thought that for those of us for whom suicide is anathema, we're compelled to do this work. I mean, it's essential that we be doing it. I mean, if not, then we're participating in self-destruction, even through passivity. Anyway, thank you. I think this is very strong and wonderful.
Oh, thank you.
Okay, one more question and then we're going to go to the chat.
Thank you, Phyllis Farrell. I guess I've been struggling with, at the national level, how do we address these corporate takeovers of farming practices, right to farm bills, legislation that releases chemical companies from liability with their pesticides and herbicides. How do we do that? Especially, I'm from Iowa, and I don't want to see what's happened in Iowa coming here. But the agrochemical and factory farms have a grip on that state.
Yeah, no, it's true. It's been kind of like what the word is. It's like just again the speed that a lot of the change is happening since Trump has been in office, in terms of the closing down of various offices or cutting of various funding programs, and just kind of like overnight, just hearing from colleagues, they're like, oh, my project's no longer being funded. Now we have to like lay off all our workers. We have to close all these offices. And the environmental justice, the EPA is closing down all 31 of their environmental justice offices. And then, yeah, a lot of I mentioned the food banks earlier. Our Thurston County Food Bank gets a lot of they purchase a lot of food from local farms through some different USDA grant programs and stuff. And now those are like, I think, the status of those are very questionable and stuff. And but I think really the solution goes back to like the local, because really, and there are some different food sovereignty activists that are pointing this out, that a lot of those big institutions, like a lot of the programs from USDA, from USAID, for instance, that some of my colleagues, I've been doing research on, like different participatory kind of like farmer programs that are being cut now. At the end of the day, like those institutions were still kind of designed to set up these colonial systems. And so, yeah, kind of the shuttering of them, and a lot of the like these regulations that are being like dismantled and stuff. Like, yeah, it's very, very sad for sure. And I think it just speaks to the importance of the local, yeah, exactly what our friend earlier was just saying, that we have to really, I think now's not the time to be, sort of complacent, but just to really organize locally. And that can look like a lot of different ways too. It doesn't have to all be the same thing. I think, again, like mimicking the way nature systems work, ecosystems work. There's, ecosystems are most vibrant and healthy when there's a lot of diversity, biodiversity, and so an abundance. And so, yeah, activism doesn't have to look the same way at all. And so there's a lot of different ways for people to be more active locally.
Give some specific examples. Like, give us some concrete examples we can do in this community.
The question is, what can we do in this community? Very specific actions. But I do have a couple let's come back to that one.
Yeah.
There's some folks that need to be put on the microphone. It's related to that question, what to do specifically, and then Nathan has a question. Well, I'll just jump in if you don't mind,
Yeah,
Prita.
please do.
I was just walking to the Blue Heron Bakery on Mud Bay Road that's been there 50 years, for those of us that have lived here that long, and there was a storefront. And on that storefront, next to the Blue Heron Bakery, were all these different farmers that have community-sourced agriculture, CSAs. And I could order from all these different local farms, fruits, vegetables, eggs, milk. And so I'm going to sign up for that. I just saw it a couple days ago. Now, the big question is, are they going to bring me a giant box of food that I can't eat that fast? And so I'm going to find out, as my neighbors want to share that. But it's a really big question that she's posing to us about how do you transform a global food system?
Yeah.
And food hubs.
So, yeah, so we do
and then
have
I'm going to
one-
give it to Nathan.
Yeah, we do have one in the South Sound area, so the South Sound Food Hub, I believe it is, but it's been forming in the last few years, and it's gaining strength. And so a lot of different farms, it's basically like an aggregate, like it's like a producers cooperative.
Is that what I saw? The
That might have been it. They might have been, so
food hub, South
Yeah.
Sound Food Hub.
yeah, so it's like a number of different farms that participate, and then you get a weekly box of vegetables that come from all these different farmers. And so that's another way to support the local economy. But yeah, if you're in a position to sort of call it vote with your dollars, to put your money into farmers markets, into these CSA programs, and that's definitely one way to do it. And then Blue Heron is also a worker-owned cooperative. Some of my students are doing a project with them too. So they're both a consumer cooperative and a worker cooperative. So you could also join the bakery as well. And then that's another way, again, to support the local economy. But yeah.
This is Nathan's question.
Okay, so, you talked a little bit about the Green Revolution, and so I'm gonna tie that into my question. But, the U.S. leads the world as like an exporter of a lot of agricultural goods. And so I was wondering, like, this idea of like food regimes, can you speak to the evolution of food regimes and like the emergence of the U.S. as the dominant food regime, like after Britain? And I guess I was curious, like, do you feel like the Green Revolution played a part in the like takeover of the U.S. as like the food regime that we see now?
Oh yeah, definitely. Yeah, so yeah, this concept of food regimes, that's something it's like a concept we use in like food systems, like scholarship. And so just to understand sort of we could say the history of our food system into these three regimes. So there was the British dominated regime, which was like the British Empire, so the colonial era. So that was, just from the mid 1700s or so through the 1800s until like the World Wars basically. And then after World War II, the second food regime and the US became dominant. So yeah, basically as like Europe, so much of Europe had to be rebuilt after World War II, the US sort of kind of became this superpower in that period. And there are a number of government policies. So yeah, thinking about policy, the New Deal, there were some different farm program, the sort of predecessors to the current like farm bill programs we have today were established during that time period, but they supported a lot of the farmers in the Midwest, for instance. And so all that kind of worked to have the US become more dominant in that way. And yeah, the Green Revolution was a big part of that as well. And today we're in this, what we call it the neoliberal food regime, the third food regime. So from the 1990s now, so it's more of the corporate food regime. So now it's not so much tied to one country like Britain or the US, but it's like multinational corporations that are, controlling the food system and stuff. So in this current food regime, but yeah, hopefully did that. Yeah.
All right. There is a couple questions online. The first one says, this is from Ben. He says, I'm curious to learn more about the concept of local control, particularly in areas of regulatory control and relatedly liability and access to credit. Your thoughts?
Local regulatory control. Okay, yeah, I don't know if it's, okay, I do see Ben is there. I don't know if it's possible for the folks on Zoom to chat more. I could, maybe a little bit more explanation. Yeah, okay, that'd be great.
My apologies. I had to figure out how to unmute. Did that work?
Yes, I can hear you.
Thank you. I think when you got around to your slides and sections on, I posed that question before you reached your slides and sections on what a model of holistic food sovereignty would look like. So I think I have a little better sense of it. On the credit side, you'd be looking at local cooperatives, consumer financing, rather than large-scale national commercial financing. On the regulatory side, well, part of the challenges of industrial agriculture has been that when something goes wrong, it goes wrong in a really big, splashy way. Dozens, perhaps hundreds of deaths, literally tens of thousands of recalled product. I have no idea what you do with that much lunch meat. And substantial liability experienced by the producers and insurers in that type of industrial system. If you come with local control, are we thinking removal of liability rules? Are we thinking county inspectors coming out? Are we thinking different rules, not necessarily wisely made, but politically made from county to county? So those are the examples.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for elaborating on that, Ben. That's, a good question. And for sure, and I think for me, what I'm offering too is just like, definitely don't have all the answers. That's a really good question. And I've heard some colleagues say before too that oftentimes our work is more like sort of we're not necessarily offering like a roadmap of where we should go because it's so, again, it depends so much on like the people, like that idea of like really that direct democracy and stuff to, to kind of work through like, how would that work if bringing all the power of the food system into like local communities, then how do you have, what happens to like these regulatory like entities that are sort of, supervising, supposed to be like keeping tabs on like things happening at these bigger levels and stuff. And I think that's a lot of the creative solutions, again, coming from the people. But it could look like different ways, like maybe in networks. That's why I think the movement building is so important. It's not just like hyper local in terms of like just support like local farms in your own town, but really we have to be part of a bigger movement interconnected with other areas and places. And I think through those networks that creates sort of like opportunities for communities to sort of regulate themselves in those ways as well. But no, that's a good question. There's a lot of things to.
Yeah, I think it was answered before, but I'm just going to pose it again in case you have anything else to offer. So they're related in my mind. So the first one was, how do you envision our transition to these methods of food systems? How can we really feed the world? And then this question below that, how do you see these principles in action?
Yeah, definitely. So, so this idea of feeding the world, that comes up a lot too, because that's oftentimes the we call it the trope, but like sort of the industrialized agriculture, that's sort of their motto, is that we need all this technology, we need the GMOs, we need the chemical fertilizers and herbicides to feed the world because the population is growing, 8+ billion people, and we need all these technologies. And from agroecology, we say no, actually, like first of all, the global food system is not feeding the world because we have so much like astronomical hunger, and now famines happening today. And then look at how much food gets wasted in our current food system too. But actually, a lot of social scientists, when they actually measure it, they do find that like the agroecological methods that are small scale, that are much more biodiverse, that don't have such a myopic focus on yield, but more on like the health of the ecosystems as well, that they actually, over time, they actually do produce more food than the industrialized system, because the industrialized system is degrading the health of the environments, of the waters, of the soils. So over time, they can increase yields in the short term, but over the long term, it actually degrades the possibilities to grow more food. And so, again, this idea of democracy too, that like peasants in the global south, they don't need like corporations based in Iowa to feed them. Like they can feed themselves. So it's kind of like a paternalistic question too. Like, it's not like the global food system's place to try to feed the world, but the people can feed themselves. They just need to have like access to all the resources to do so. But and then the principles in action too. I mean, Nathan was just reading about the Freedom Farmers book. If you want to like maybe share about maybe some of the work happening in Detroit, or any of the things that you learned that you thought were interesting from Freedom Farmers, because that's like a good kind of principle in action too, I would say, for people to work with them. But
I appreciate the questions that came from the chat and also from the room. I think your conversation with us tonight was an aspirational model of something that's different than now, and it has to evolve. And those of us that have worked in nonprofit and in government roles, on regulatory roles, you have to consider safety, liability, health, all of those, which I think your groups are going to start thinking about and working on. So we'll stay tuned. And so we'll give another round of applause. And if you'd like to talk to her later, she's here. Thank you.
thank you.
Thank you, Prita.